Did you know that feminism was used as a weapon to undermine the civil rights movement of the 1960 elections? That the government enacted a plan of action to convince black women that being a woman was more important than her blackness? In the United States, the black freedom struggle of the 1950s and 1960s is commonly remembered as a fight for voting rights and desegregation. While those goals were real, they were only the surface layer of a much deeper political transformation that was taking place. By the early 1960s, black political movements were no longer asking simply to be included in American society. Increasingly, they were organizing to gain power within it. Organizations such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, founded in 1960, the Black Panther Party, founded in Oakland in 1966 by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, and earlier groups such as the Nation of Islam, were building parallel systems of economic support, political education, community defense, and social services. These movements were constructing what government officials recognized as alternative power structures. To federal intelligence agencies, this represented not a civil rights issue, but a national security concern. In 1967, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover publicly described black nationalist organizations as the greatest internal threat to the security of the United States. This assessment did not remain theoretical. In 1956, the FBI launched a covert operation known as COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. Initially aimed at the Communist Party, it expanded throughout the 1960s to target black political organizations, civil rights leaders, and anti-war activists. COINTELPRO had 4 primary objectives, later revealed through declassified FBI documents and confirmed by the U.S. Senate's Church Committee investigation in 1975. First, to prevent the unification of black political groups. Second, to create internal conflict and mistrust. Third, to discredit movement leaders publicly and privately. Fourth, to neutralize organizations before they could gain mass influence. One of the most effective tools used to achieve these goals was internal division, particularly along gender lines. It is important to understand that sexism did exist within black political movements of the 1960s. Leadership positions were often held by men, while women performed much of the organizing labor, administrative work, and grassroots coordination. Rather than allowing these tensions to be resolved internally, the FBI deliberately exploited them. Through forged letters, planted rumors, and anonymous communications, female organizers were encouraged to view male leadership as abusive, exploitative, or untrustworthy. Male leaders were portrayed as obstacles to women's liberation rather than partners in a shared struggle. This did not require inventing grievances. It required amplifying them. At the same time the FBI was destabilizing organizations on the ground, another intelligence agency was shaping the broader ideological environment. The Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, did not operate primarily through arrests or surveillance inside the United States. Instead, it specialized in cultural warfare. After World War II, the CIA developed strategies based on a simple realization: controlling ideas was often more effective than controlling territory. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the CIA covertly funded cultural organizations, academic journals, artists, writers, student groups, and political movements through front organizations and foundations. One of the most well-documented examples was the Congress for Cultural Freedom, established in 1950, which promoted ideological narratives aligned with U.S. geopolitical interests. The purpose was not to silence dissent, but to redirect it into forms that posed no structural threat. This approach was applied globally and domestically. During this same period, second-wave feminism was emerging in the United States. It addressed real and serious issues: workplace discrimination, lack of reproductive autonomy, sexual exploitation, and legal inequality. The CIA did not create feminism. However, it recognized feminism's potential to redirect political energy away from race-based collective struggle and toward gender-based individual struggle. A key documented example of CIA involvement in feminist organizing is Gloria Steinem. In the early 1960s, Steinem worked with the Independent Research Service, an organization later revealed to have received CIA funding. The IRS was used to influence youth movements and international student politics during the Cold War. Steinem later acknowledged this connection publicly and defended it as anti-communist work. This admission is significant not because it discredits feminism, but because it confirms that U.S. intelligence agencies actively engaged with feminist movements as part of broader ideological strategy. Black women occupied a uniquely important position within Black liberation movements. They were not only participants, they were organizers, strategists, fundraisers, educators, and community anchors. They connected political activism to family life, church networks, and neighborhood structures. From a strategic standpoint, redirecting Black women away from race-centered politics had cascading effects. It weakened Black family cohesion. It isolated Black male leadership. It fractured trust within organizations. It collapsed long-term organizing capacity. The objective was not to turn Black women against Black men emotionally, but to detach them politically. Within this context emerges what is more accurately understood as the Schomburg intellectual framework, rather than a single plan or document. This framework refers to a race-centered tradition of Black historical consciousness and political thought, preserved through institutions such as the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture and articulated by Pan-African and Black nationalist thinkers throughout the 20th century. The Schomburg framework emphasized collective identity, shared history, and structural analysis of oppression. It framed Black struggle as communal and systemic rather than individual and interpersonal. From the standpoint of intelligence agencies, this kind of race-first political identity was dangerous. Unified oppressed groups pose a threat to centralized power. Internal gender conflict fragments movements faster than racial conflict alone. When internal identity disputes replace collective political goals, movements dissolve without needing to be defeated directly. By elevating gender oppression above race and class, political struggle becomes individualized, therapeutic, and institutionally manageable. This framework mirrors colonial divide-and-rule strategies used across Africa, Asia, and Latin America throughout the 20th century. The application of this strategy in Black America followed a clear pattern. First, Black male leadership was removed through imprisonment, exile, or assassination. Between 1965 and 1971, nearly every prominent Black radical leader was killed, incarcerated, or forced underground. This includes Malcolm X in 1965, Fred Hampton in 1969, and the mass incarceration of Black Panther leadership nationwide. Second, narratives shifted. Black men were increasingly framed as the primary oppressors of Black women, while structural white supremacy was de-emphasized. Third, gender-first politics were rewarded. Feminist-aligned activism received media coverage, academic legitimacy, nonprofit funding, and career pathways. Race-first politics were marginalized, criminalized, or labeled reactionary. This was not accidental. It was selective reinforcement. By the late 1970s, the transformation was complete. Black political movements no longer presented a unified front. Organizing gave way to discourse. Structural critique gave way to personal grievance. Collective liberation gave way to individual advancement. Black men and women continued to share culture and history, but no longer shared political strategy. From the perspective of the state, this outcome required no permanent repression. The movement had reorganized itself into manageable parts. This analysis does not argue that Black women were manipulated or that their grievances were illegitimate. Sexism was real. Patriarchy existed. Feminism addressed genuine harms. What it demonstrates is that intelligence agencies exploited those realities to redirect political energy away from collective power and toward internal conflict. When movements threaten power, they are rarely confronted directly. They are reshaped. The Black liberation movement was not defeated by force alone. It was neutralized through division. That legacy continues to shape political discourse today. The effects of this reorganization did not end in the 1970s. They unfolded gradually across generations as the children and grandchildren of the disrupted movements inherited the outcomes rather than the original struggle. One of the most significant long-term consequences was the normalization of gender conflict as a primary political and cultural lens. What began as a tactical division inside Black political movements evolved into a broader social framework through which men and women were encouraged to interpret their frustrations, failures, and disappointments. Over time, this framework expanded beyond the Black community and became a dominant feature of American culture as a whole. However, because Black communities were the original testing ground for this strategy, the long-term effects there have been more severe, more visible, and more emotionally charged. The original objective of intelligence agencies was not to erase race entirely, but to reduce the effectiveness of race-based collective politics by fragmenting it internally. Gender was used as the wedge because it cut through families, relationships, and everyday life in ways ideology alone could not. In practice, this meant that race never disappeared from the equation. Instead, it became entangled with gender in ways that produced confusion rather than solidarity. Race-based grievances remained unresolved. Gender-based grievances were elevated. The result was not liberation, but displacement. As race-centered political organizing declined, personal relationships increasingly became the arena where unresolved structural tensions played out. Without strong collective frameworks to interpret oppression as systemic and external, frustration was redirected inward toward romantic partners and potential partners. This is where the long-term consequences become most visible today. In contemporary discourse, it is now common to hear Black men publicly declare that non-Black women are more cooperative, more feminine, more supportive, or more suitable for long-term relationships than Black women. It is equally common to hear Black women publicly declare that non-Black men are more respectful, more stable, more emotionally available, or more capable of providing security than Black men. These statements are often treated as personal preferences or individual dating choices. But when they appear at scale, repeated across media platforms, podcasts, social networks, and cultural commentary, they function as social indicators. They are not random. They are patterned. They are historically traceable. What is being expressed is not simply romantic preference, but the externalization of internalized conflict. Because the original strategy reframed struggle away from collective power and toward interpersonal dynamics, men and women were taught, implicitly and explicitly, to see each other as the primary source of disappointment and limitation. When collective explanations disappear, personal blame takes their place. Black men, lacking institutional power but still culturally framed as patriarchs, become symbols of failure rather than victims of structural exclusion. Black women, carrying both racial and gendered burdens, become symbols of resistance, independence, and frustration rather than partners in a shared struggle. Neither role allows for reconciliation. Importantly, this dynamic does not require conscious hostility. Many individuals genuinely believe they are making rational, experience-based choices. Yet the social environment in which those choices are formed has been shaped by decades of narrative reinforcement. Media portrayals, academic frameworks, therapeutic language, online discourse, all reinforce the idea that gender conflict is natural, inevitable, and more politically relevant than race-based unity. This normalization is the true measure of success from a strategic standpoint. While these dynamics now extend across racial and cultural lines, their impact remains most pronounced in the Black community because the original disruption targeted the foundational structures of Black collective life. The weakening of family cohesion, the erosion of shared political language, the replacement of organizing with discourse. These outcomes compound across generations. The children of fractured movements do not inherit strategy. They inherit tension. This helps explain why conversations about dating, marriage, and relationships within the Black community often carry an intensity disproportionate to the topic itself. They are not just about romance. They are about unresolved history, unresolved power, unresolved betrayal, and unresolved loss of collective direction. What appears as personal preference is often the surface expression of structural disorientation. It is important to be precise here. The presence of interracial relationships is not the issue. Personal attraction is not the issue. Individual choice is not the issue. The issue is the narrative framing. Specifically, when choosing outside the group is framed as an escape from one's own people rather than a personal decision. That framing signals internal fracture. An internal fracture was the objective. The original strategy succeeded not because it eliminated Black political consciousness, but because it redirected it into channels that could not produce unified action. Gender conflict replaced collective struggle. Identity discourse replaced institution building. Personal fulfillment replaced shared responsibility. The result is a population deeply aware of injustice, yet increasingly fragmented in how that injustice is understood and addressed. When movements threaten power, the most effective response is not suppression, but reorientation. The Black liberation movement was not destroyed. It was repurposed. And the gender divide visible today, especially within Black communities, is not an accident of culture, nor merely a product of modern social media. It is the long-term outcome of a strategic effort to make unity difficult, intimacy fragile, and collective power improbable. That legacy did not end in the past. It lives in the present. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.